Did you? Yeah, I had it in mind too.
I hadn't, the stuff I've noticed, I hadn't seen anything that shocked me.
Now, there's a couple things in it that are very, what I would consider modern, I guess. But we'll have to explore that one of these days. Let's see.
Wes is taking us to a new level. Because when he knows the new versions of the Bible, it's been 20 years, somebody murdered him.
Well, you have to work either up here or down in the trap last week.
I know mine didn't work up here, I forgot to turn it on.
That's good.
That can help.
Yeah, that can help.
I set it up and everything,
Small.
and when I came up here, I was so thinking about, getting started on the lesson, I didn't even think to turn it on.
That's funny.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So far, so good.
Chris was showing, morning, Mr. Jarvis. Chris was showing, in the Billy Graham book he has there where he was talking about meek, and meek is a difficult word to some degree for us. I find so many times, like when you look at the King James or anything like that, where it's this older use of the word, I think sometimes over time, words just change, and they kind of take on a whole nother meaning. One in the KJV in particular that I always use is awesome. Awesome in those days kind of meant something terrible. Like it was awesome. It was a big thing, but it wasn't. You couldn't use it as a positive.
Associated with tragedy or something.
Yeah, and now we only use it as a positive to some degree. We wouldn't look at it as an awesome villain, or something like that. It's interesting the way English words change. So many times for me, I get on to my kids when they use a word. I said, "That's not how you use that." I don't know what you're trying to say about that, but any slang kind of word, and then the word just changes into that. It's strange.
But when I think about meek, I just think about Donald Trump. It's probably about as far from.
Probably the least meek, whatever the word means. He's the least.
As far from it as you can be.
That is hilarious. Very funny. That's pretty good.
When you work here, is this one usually here before?
He went to Washington.
Washington DC? I thought, wow, see some old work buddies of his.
But I just want to see the fireworks and everything. Just want to be a part of everything.
I wonder if he knows anybody.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He told me
He spent a lot of time, from what I understand.
27 years.
Long time. He probably knows all the side roads.
When we were there, we went by the Internal Revenue Service building. I wondered if that's where Peter worked.
That's right. How different, I bet the cultures are from moving from here to moving there to moving back here. I bet it's just very different.
I don't think he necessarily fit into that culture.
Yes, I think he says that most of the time, yeah. Which I don't know if we would either, I don't know.
No, I don't think he is.
We can get another 2 minutes or something if you want to. See if someone else strolls in. What did you think about today's verses? Did you find it interesting?
No. Just because, I think, well, especially fasting.
Yes.
And
Fasting is different.
to me, I've always noticed thin people tend to fast, but fat people aren't really known for fasting.
That'd be true.
That should be pretty slow.
But it's, you know, fasting, not many people do it anymore.
Last church I was in, I have some problems with fasting. I get a little woozy. I said, well, you could drink some water. It'll make me feel better.
The funniest part about it, I got ChatGPT to help me with, but to me, being a Gentile, and Jesus talks about the Gentiles babbling, I thought, it's bad if Jesus insults me.
Yeah, he does. That's
So I had to look up and see what he was talking about, the Gentiles babbling.
That's funny. Clearly they did.
Yeah.
We can open in prayer. Dennis, would you mind praying for us?
Father, to be able to come together with kindred spirit, look at your word, discuss its application for our lives. We thank you. You never want to take a privilege for granted. We ask now that your spirit be our teacher. Lead us to the application of your truth. Thank you.
Is it working? I can scoot closer actually, since Peter's not here. I'll scoot in a little closer. You know,
Stand up.
I have something important about it today. Morning, sir. How are y'all?
Good.
Very good, very good. I was going to suppose, before we got started, I wanted to open starting to talk about actors, you know? And I was going to suppose that no matter who was in this class this morning, if we started talking about actors, I think there's one that we can all agree on. But before I do that, I'll just say, does anybody have a favorite actor?
Well, I like a lot.
Yeah, I like a lot of them. You know, one in particular that I thought we would all agree on is 96-year-old Clint Eastwood. I feel like Clint Eastwood, he's enough to be able to get you to go at least try to the film. You know, I think that's pretty fair, you know? You know, for me, growing up, Clint Eastwood was always a good one. I have so many, you know, favorites. I don't know, you know, one in particular. In the older days, I would have told you Robert De Niro, or generation before that, Marlon Brando, or whoever, you know. But,
Peter O'Toole.
oh, Peter
What I know
O'Toole.
about Harold's, I wrote from Lawrence of Arabia.
There you go. That's right. That's all the research I've done on that. No, that's good. Anybody else have an actor? It is difficult for me now. I like to know them just through their roles rather than them personally, you know? Because once I find out them personally, they're so complicated, you know? Daniel Day-Lewis, for example. Man, I like to watch his movies, and I'd rather not listen to his interviews, you know? I don't know.
Why do they have to be so weird?
Man, they are something, aren't they? They really are. And then once you think you found one who's like, oh no, this one, no, it's probably not. You know, it's probably not going to line up with you. You know, and you know, there's a lot of actors who are. Peter O'Toole's an excellent one to talk about, but like, who are just great at becoming something they're not. You know, and then convincing you of something that they're not. I think that's a good way of looking at acting, you know. Playing a character that that's not who they actually are, you know. And so many times for me, I think, to pick on someone else whose personal convictions are much different than the characters he plays, when I watch Tom Hanks, I'm like, wow, this guy's this. He's not, his real life, he's way over here, you know, and it's just very, but that's what they're supposed to do. You know, they're supposed to be playing this character that they're not, you know. Convince us that they are something that they're not. I think is a good layout to our study here today. You know, about 500 years before Jesus, the Greeks, they had plays that they would put on. They would often have a stage or an area of a theater in each of their major cities, and they would have plays. They would have on-stage performances, and they were much different in that day. They would have a chorus of men. Men are the only actors in this town, and they would have a chorus of men, maybe 15 or 20 men, and they were much more of like the narrator rather than the specific characters, And so they would narrate the story. They would comment on what happened, what wasn't happening, and they represented the voice of the people, much like reading a book. I think is the way I would look at it. They would be kind of like a narrator mixed with a choir, and they spoke very loudly. They told the story, but they're not in the story. And then there was this man, and his name was Thespis. And Thespis was who we recognize as the first actor. And he steps out of the chorus, and he becomes one of the characters in the story. And it creates dialogue, and it creates this whole other aspect to, acting. Instead of saying the king has entered, shouted by the chorus, he would step up and say, "I am the king," and it was a much different dynamic. It was so different. The chorus could ask questions, and then the actor could answer, and I think that was a huge innovative step towards what we have today in our modern film or stage, plays and different things. A common name for actors are thespians, named after Thespis himself. By Jesus' time, though, theaters, they would have been all over, the entire area there. And then actors, they travel city to city, and they would put on these plays. I like to look at it like I have a role that I play. Wayne has a role that he plays. We only have this one play, and so we would show our one story that we wrote in all of these different cities. We wouldn't take on different roles. We just stuck to the one play that we had, and we would travel around and see how people liked it. We're going to be here Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. You can catch us in Nazareth next Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Something like that. But they would travel around, and that. So when we're talking today about these hypocrites, that is who we're talking about. Are these actors? I think that's and the crowd, which we talked a lot about last week, they would have immediately known who Jesus was talking about. I do feel like there are famous ones at this point. It's not anything like it is today, but another famous thing this has we're talking about pantomimes. That was a big thing then, so they were very famous. The performers on the stage were very famous, but they wouldn't have been highly respected like we try to attribute them today. Their names wouldn't have been preserved in the same way as like rulers or philosophers or warriors. That would have been how you would have gained, celebrity status in those days. But so the Greek word that Jesus uses today is hypocrites, is how we're going to translate it. And it just means a stage actor. And I think that if you look at it in that most basic sense, it really flows in today's subject. It's somebody who's wearing a mask, someone who's playing a role, someone who is pretending to be something they're not. And often in those days they would wear masks. Like I said, it's men only. But in these stories by this time, you would have had female characters. So the men would have put on the mask of a female, and they would have played the role of the queen or the damsel in distress. But they're all men, and so I like to look at it like there's this it's someone whose outward appearance conceals the truth about who they really are, and that's a pretty good way of looking at it. I can just see, this guy, the main guy there, he's got the beard, and he's probably using a lady's voice if he's a lady character, and it's just very, of course, we'd be thinking, yeah, why would you not just use women, but that's just the way it was in the day, But so Jesus takes this very ordinary stage words, theatrical word, he takes it, he uses it in the spiritual way. And he says a hypocrite isn't just someone who acts, it's someone whose outward religious appearance hides the reality of what's going on inside. And so you see the face, but there's another face behind the mask. And I think that's a pretty good one. Jesus isn't concerned with what everybody else can see. He's concerned about what God can see. And so, and I feel like that's always been God's concern. You know, as we look throughout the Old Testament, tying into this, you know, before this, if we said Jeremiah 31, you know, I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. Ezekiel 36, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes. And I think religion changes what people do, but the gospel changes what people want. And I think that inward that is what Jesus is talking about, the inward spirituality of the people here in the scene. And so, you know, one thing I'll say right before we get into this is there is this contradiction that people outside of studying the Sermon on the Mount call out here, which I think is important to address and confirm that it's not one. But as we looked into last week's, you know, lessons, we were talking about, you know, the Beatitudes, the salt and light, and he's walking through all these things. In verse 16, he does point out to let your light shine before others. And there is this first glance contradiction where when you say, here one chapter he's saying, let people see these things. And now he's saying, don't let people see these things. So which is it? And of course what you're doing there is you're only reading the first half of each verse. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But if you only do that, you say, let them see. And then you're saying, don't let them see. But Jesus, he doesn't stop there. He has, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. So who receives the glory in that sentence? It's God. And here in verse 1, in order for them to be seen by them, and in this instance, who receives the glory? You do. And so they're very opposite, but they are kind of brought out in this contradictory way sometimes, which I think it's important to know the difference. You know, the audience is really the difference in both of these. To be seen by God, to be seen by men or the world, or you know, just focusing on yourself. I think that's the big difference. The audience changes everything. The action hasn't changed. You know, you're giving, you're serving, you're loving, you're doing all these things. And the only thing that's changed is the audience. And so that's why Jesus continually comes back to the heart, and that's really, you know, the basis of your relationship. You know, the Pharisees believed righteousness was measured by what did you do, how much of that did you do. But Jesus asks why you did it. So it's the same action, but it's a whole different heart. You know, one other word that I'll point out here. There's a lot of repetitious words in this section in the Sermon on the Mount and in chapter 6, but the big one is reward. If you highlighted the word reward in the verses that we're talking about today, it is so many times. Verse 1, there's no reward. Verse 2, they have received their reward. Verse 4, your Father will reward you. Verse 5, they have received their reward. Verse 6, your Father will reward you. Verse 16, they've received their reward. Verse 18, your Father will reward you. And there's this rhythm to it, which I feel like it's this drumbeat of the Sermon on the Mount. You know, that is one of the focuses in this section. He intentionally repeats it. For me, there's no accidental verses in Matthew. It is crafted in a specific way. And I hope at the end I'll have enough time to talk about that. But I do think the word reward there is a very important, you know, word for us to keep in mind. It's repeated in the Sermon on the Mount 18 times, and it's not on accident. But I do think that there are two reward systems that Jesus is laying out here. You have the earth's reward, where you have the applause and you have this fame or attention and recognition, and you get the likes on Facebook or all these different things. And from that you gain this reputation, you know. But then there's heaven's reward, which is the Father's approval and His pleasure and His well done. And it is these two different things that Jesus lays out here. Because He says you can't pursue both. if your goal is the applause of the people, then you're going to get exactly what you want, and that's what you're going to get. And he asks, you know, or he even says, you know, that's what they're going to get, and that's it. You know, there's this Leon Morris is a famous commentator on Matthew, and he says that he likes looking at it like there's this stamp of paid in full for everything you're going to get for it. He puts a stamp on it. He says that's what you're going to get. You know, you've received your reward, and so I like that image of there's this paid in full on it already, and that's the extent of what you get. If you want the applause of the crowd, stamp. There you go. You're set. There's nothing else to collect. So we're going to pick up here in chapter 6 today. We left off with the salt and light, the attitudes last week, and we're skipping over the 5 antitheses where he says, you've heard it interpreted like this. What it really means is this. I love that's a Craig Evans summary of the antitheses. Instead of saying you've heard it said like this, well, let me say it like this. It is you've heard it interpreted like this. But what it really means is this. So following that up, there's going to be 2 subjects in these 4 verses. Wayne only gave me 4 verses this week. No, I'm just kidding. I only took 4 verses and I gave him all the good stuff. But no, even in these 4 verses, there's 2 things that are going on. There's 2 different subjects. The first 2 is discussing a believer's religion. And then the second 2 discuss a believer's giving. So I'll read these first 4 verses in the NIV first. Be careful. You can click on this slide. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. I really like that translation, but I'm gonna give you another, for me, a little more well-rounded, less word-for-word type of translation. The NLT phrases it like this: watch out. Do not do your good deeds publicly, to be admired by others, for you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to someone in need, don't do it as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I tell you the truth, they have received all the reward they will ever get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private, and your Father, who sees everything, will reward you. And so here he is laying this out for his disciples, for the crowd, and he's not changing what they do. He's changing why they do. I think it is the main thing to say here. You know, there's a lot of stuff that happens here. One of the main words there in the beginning is righteousness. Don't practice your righteousness in front of others. The NLT uses good deeds. But that's a very interesting word. In some translations, in the KJV, it uses the word alms, which is a alms giving even. But the word righteousness, I do think here is a much better use of the word. And then he gives these 3 examples, which we're going to be going through today, which is the giving, which is the praying, and then the fasting, which Matthew lays out here. And each one is an example of this, this righteous living, this typical living that Jesus assumes that they're already doing. We'll get into that too, but I really like that. But and so verse 2, he kind of narrows it down, and he goes into this first example of giving to the needy. And so the first word here, though, is beware, and I think that's a good one to highlight. Be careful. And he's warning this group. He's not talking to the Romans. He's not talking to these tax collectors or all these pagans. He's talking to the same group that he was talking to last week. These people who give, these people who pray, these people who fast. And those are all good things. It's a good behavior done with bad motives. I think is a good way to look at it. So careful attention to this. Guard your own hearts as you practice these righteous things, these good deeds. Verse 2 says, when you give. And so he assumes that they do, and I think that's fair. He doesn't look as giving as optional. I think that's a good way of saying that. The question isn't whether, it's how. And so then he says, don't sound a trumpet. And it is, I don't think it's a disrespectful comment for me here. As I say, there is some humor in these 4 verses for me. There is some exaggerated wording that he's using here, which is okay. It's okay to use an exaggerated, humorous example, I think, when he's saying that here come the hypocrites as they sound their trumpets and they're like, hey, look, I'm giving. Like another way I kind of see it is I like those Publishers Clearinghouse checks, like where you have this big, huge check and they're like, here we go, I'm going to put my money in this week. Did everybody see that? Because that's the one I just put in, and you're drawing this attention to yourself. Not saying that anyone actually would sound the trumpet, but I do feel like they probably, as the planes crossing them, they put their big, huge Publishers Clearinghouse check in just to let everybody see.
Denise used to give me a hard time. On the scrap metal business, we dealt a lot of cash, especially back in the old days. And so I always had cash, and I liked paying cash for everything. We just almost always dealt with cash. So we'd go out somewhere to eat. I'd usually have I'd keep my money in my front pocket in a money clip or something like that. And so when it came time to pay, I would pull it out. And Denise would say, put that down. She would accuse me. She said, you take it out.
That's it.
That's what I think about.
It's the same thing, and I do feel like Jesus is using it here in the same way Denise did, where it's this exaggeration. There's this quote where they call it this grotesque exaggeration, exposing the absurdity of giving from publicity. And man, that is it, And so here we come into the hypocrites, and so Jesus is saying, don't turn your worship into this theater. Don't perform generosity or spirituality. Don't perform righteousness. Because if you do, you've already received your payment. Jesus literally says they've received it in full. And like I said, the whole paid in full thing, I like that. But I do feel like there is this humorousness to what Jesus is saying here in verse 3, where he says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Well, I feel like that's obviously impossible to some degree, but that's the point. I feel like there's this hyperbole to it where, Jesus is, he's not giving these bookkeeping instructions. He is, saying, don't even congratulate yourself, Christian giving is marked by this self-forgetfulness rather than congratulating yourself. Verse 4, another word that's repeated so many times here, which is normal to us, but I do feel like for this audience, it stands out, is your Father. He says your Father here, and that's the title that he lays out so many times in the Sermon on the Mount. It's 12 times actually just in this section that we're in today. And so that, there's just a lot to be said for that. I think, here he is, he sees, he knows, and he rewards. And so that's his involvement here. I do feel like there's one application, if there's a main application here in this first part, it's that every act of righteousness has an audience. And I think as they're asking themselves, who is my audience? Who do I do this for? I think we're supposed to ask ourselves that as well. Who is our audience? Because that's the question that Jesus is asking. It's who am I hoping notices this? That's great.
And I would say another way to look at that is that you're acting with no audience. When you're acting with no audience, you get into the truth. The true righteousness is acting. And I have always thought, this is probably not acting in true righteousness, but I have always thought that somebody that you're not doing it for any other reason than the person needs it. And I've always thought, nobody knows about it. When you do it like that, it's like you get double credit for it. And that's the way I look at it, which is probably not the right way to look at it, but it's the way I think about it.
Until you tell someone else.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I just did.
Until you tell somebody else. It's funny, Wes talk about this audience, and because it continues on. The next two things that he talks about is prayer, and then he talks about fasting. He continues on in this life about not acting and doing it in his audience to be seen. There's also another part about prayer and fasting that I think is one thing I have discovered that my friend that I enjoy reading N.T. Wright, if there's a subject in the Bible, he's such a prolific writer. I think he's written a book on it, and I think I own most of those books that he's written. And he wrote a book on the Lord and His Prayer. So I said, well, maybe a good place to go back and look at it is just to go back and see a couple of things that he said about his book. So let me just, I got a couple of things I want to read. And the first, we just talked about prayer. And I think it's something that we can all relate to. When he says prayer is, of course, a mystery. It's become quite commonplace to say this. Many Christians, including many clergy, have come to accept that they don't find prayer easy, that they don't really understand what it does or can do. Many have become, in a puzzle sort of way, vaguely reconciled to this perplexity, as though it makes them in some way second-class citizens. Some lay folk, if you ask them about their own prayer, will tend to say, oh, I'll leave that to the clergy. Some clergy will say, oh, I'll leave that serious stuff to the monks and nuns. But there's good scriptural warrant for finding prayer puzzling and mysterious. St. Paul, in a famous passage, says that we don't know how to pray or what to pray for, as we ought, and says that we therefore depend on God's Spirit to help us, catching us up into the agonizing dialogue between the living God and the pain of the world, even though we really don't understand what's happening. That may be humbling, but it also should be encouraging. So, let's kind of jump into the scripture. I think this is from, I use the CSB, what the book uses here. The version says, whenever you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites. Because they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by people. Truly I tell you, they have their reward. But when you pray, go into your private room, shut your door, and pray to the Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees you in secret will reward you. When you pray, don't babble like the Gentiles, since they imagine they'll be heard for their many words. Don't be like them, because your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. As I mentioned earlier when I kind of looked at this, I thought, what's he talking about? I'm a Gentile. What's he talking about the babbling? So I tried, I did a little bit of research on it. And it says that the key idea is not that long prayers are wrong. Jesus himself prayed them. Rather, he's criticizing a particular kind of prayer that was common in many pagan religions. Babbling, the Greek word translated babbling is batologia. Likely means to repeat words mechanically or mindlessly, to use empty, meaningless phrases, to pile up words in the belief that quantity will persuade the deity. Almost sounds like a politician. The emphasis on empty repetition. Why does Jesus mention the Gentiles? In Jesus' day, many non-Jewish religions believed their gods could be influenced by a long list of divine names, repeated formulas or chants, magical incantations, endless repetition of prayers. The idea was that if someone said enough words or found the right combination of words, that God would eventually respond. A biblical example appears in 1 Kings 18, where the prophets of Baal cried out repeatedly from morning until afternoon, "O Baal, answer us." They kept repeating themselves, hoping their God would respond. It talks about Matthew 6:8. It changes the whole approach to prayer. Christians pray to a loving Father who already knows their needs and who desires a genuine relationship, rather than being persuaded by impressive speeches. And in the second part of this, Jesus goes on to give us, I guess, what's called the Lord's Prayer, or the model prayer. And let me read something that N.T. Wright talks about it too. How do you set about praying? From our point of view, there's a fairly obvious order of priorities. We're usually in some sort of mess, and we want God to get us out of it. Then we've usually got some fairly pressing needs, and we want God to supply them. It may strike us at that point that there's a larger world out there. Again, we probably move from mess to wants. Please sort out the Middle East. Please feed the hungry. Please house the homeless. But then once more, it may dawn upon us that there's just a larger world out there. There's a larger God out there. He's not just a celestial cleaner up or sorter out of our messes and wants. He is God. He is the living God, and He is our Father. If we linger here, we may find our priorities quietly turned inside out. The contents may remain, the order will change. With that change, we move at last from paranoia to prayer, from fuss to faith. The Lord's Prayer is designed to help us make this change. A change of priority, not a change of content. This prayer doesn't pretend that pain and hunger aren't real. Some religions say that. Jesus didn't. This prayer doesn't use the greatness and majesty of God to belittle the human life. Some religions do that, but Jesus didn't. This prayer starts by addressing God immediately and lovingly as Father, and by bowing before His greatness and majesty. If you can hold these two together, you're already on your way to understanding what Christianity is all about in the Lord's Prayer. So in Matthew 6, verses 9 through 15, it says, "Therefore you should pray like this. Our Father in heaven, your name be honored as holy. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil. For if you forgive others their offenses, your heavenly Father will forgive you as well. But if you don't forgive others, your Father will not forgive your offenses." And this is another one of those things that we could spend probably a month on, talking about the Lord's Prayer and going through this. And I'm not going to try to dig into it. My hope is that we should finish early enough. I hope to have a discussion, and maybe a little bit of the discussion on the Lord's Prayer, if we want to. And it's, the thing that was always interesting in the Lord's Prayer to me is about forgiveness. If you don't forgive others, don't expect God to forgive you. It's always one of those conditional things. So let's put it off. Well, if you ain't got to, we'll come back to it and talk about it. So let's talk a little bit about fasting. That's where we go to fasting. Whenever you fast, don't be gloomy like the hypocrites. For they disfigure their faces so that their fasting is obvious to people. I just imagine somebody saying, "Oh, man, I'm so hungry, I've been fasting." I can just see it. For they disfigure their faces so that their fasting is obvious to people. Truly I tell you, they have their reward. It's the same consistent thing we always talk about in all three of these. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that your fasting isn't obvious to others, but to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now I don't think that many people, I've never been one much for fasting. I guess it's kind of one of those things I probably don't understand in this world. But let's talk about fasting. The only fast commanded by Hebrew Scripture was on Yom Kippur, and talks about it in Leviticus, in chapter 16th chapter of Leviticus, where it says, uses the phrase, afflict yourselves. And that became understanding his fasting. So everything else was voluntary or established by tradition. Fasting usually involved abstaining from food from sunrise to sunset, although longer fasts are mentioned in Scripture. The Pharisees, I thought this was interesting, the Pharisees were especially known for fasting twice a week, traditionally on Mondays and Thursdays. Jesus criticized some religious leaders, not because they fasted, but because they fasted to impress others. Some apparently neglected their appearance, put ashes on themselves, or looked deliberately miserable so people would notice their sacrifice. The disciples of John the Baptist fasted regularly. And if you remember, we had a lesson on this in Matthew 9:14, where some of John the Baptist's followers asked Jesus why his disciples don't fast like John's do. It's thought that probably, John's message was one of repentance and forgiveness, and that's kind of what we associate fasting. If I remember right, Jesus said something to the effect that they don't, because everything they need is right here. They'll love that. If I remember what we talked about. But fasting included abstaining from food, extended prayer, reading Scripture, confessing sins, wearing sackcloth and ashes during mourning, and giving to the poor. I thought that was interesting. Part of fasting, giving to the poor. So what does Jesus teach us on fasting? And it's interesting, Wes talked about giving. Jesus assumed his followers would fast. It's not, notice he said exactly what you said. When you fast, not if you fast. And his concern in all of these things was both. True fasting should be directed toward God, be accompanied by sincere prayer, not performed to gain admiration from others, flow from humility rather than self-righteousness. Believers in Acts fasted. It talks about Acts 13:2 and 3, when they were seeking God's guidance. They were appointing church elders in Acts 14:23 and dedicating themselves to prayers when the early church was fasting. Fasting was intended to express dependence on God, repentance, humility, and earnest prayer. Properly practiced fasting is meant to draw a person closer to God rather than draw attention to oneself. And it's really the same, all three of these things are the same. Draw attention to God, do it earnestly, and not draw attention to yourself. Prayer, and giving, and in fasting. Now, let's go. We got 10 or 15 minutes to talk. You want to go? What you want to talk about? Or you want to talk about prayer?
I have one comment, and then you give me like a minute, and I'll get on. One comment that I heard, I think it was John MacArthur said, which I had to make sure I was right. But the church is formed in Acts 2. And by Acts 5, you have Ananias and Sapphira, hypocrites in the church, just 3 chapters later. It's very interesting. And so it's just a part of religious groups to some degree. Unfortunately. I don't know. I find that very interesting. That's a very interesting comment. One thing I wanted to say about just the structure of Matthew's gospel. For me, it is written. He's Jewish man. He's writing in a Jewish context, you know. And the way that the Jews wrote was much different than the way we write. They didn't write in paragraph form and all, you know, have a topic sentence and all these different things, you know, like we follow. One of the, you know, they used a lot of different literary devices, and one of my favorites is chiasms. And I put a slide on there if you go down a little bit. In Matthew's gospel, it's very typical, it's way down at the bottom. It's very typical for him to use this structure. And when you look at it, it's kind of like, and it's used throughout the Bible, where they call it a chiasm. It comes from the Greek word chi, where it means like an X, where it's kind of going out and coming back in. And the idea is the text moves inward and then back out. And instead of thinking about it like A, B, C, D, which is how we would write our outlines or different things like that, it would be more like A, B, C, and then C, B, A on the way back out, C being the central focus, you know. And so it would mirror as it goes back out. So the point that was made at the beginning is mirrored at the end. And, you know, we always look at everything like it's a ladder, or it goes to a specific point and that reaches the climax, I think is a good way of looking at it. But throughout the Bible, chiasms are everywhere. And here's just a small example from Matthew 6. But I think the next slide, I have a ridiculously large one. This is Noah's flood. And if you look, it is so perfectly laid out the way the verses are that, like, I don't know how we don't all look at it. I wish that our Bible laid it out like this, you know? But the central point being that God remembered Noah. It's so good. But this is a you know, just one example. Another good example is Abraham and Isaac. Now, this is the structure of, and you don't have to see it exactly, but this is the structure of Matthew's gospel by itself, which is very created for an exact purpose. You know, when he lays out his gospel, it is for this purpose, where he comes into a central point and he goes back out. Abraham and Isaac is a very good one. If you have some time, you should look at that one. The Beatitudes is another example. Did I have one more? No. Okay. But the Beatitudes themselves have this, you know, where it goes to this central point. But the Lord's Prayer is one of the clearest examples, where you have Our Father in heaven, you have, you know, deliver us, you have hallowed be your name, forgive us, your kingdom come, give us our daily bread, and in the middle is your will be done, and being the central point. But interestingly enough, I don't have it up on the board, but I do have it here. But the Sermon on the Mount itself has its own chiastic structure. So if there's one thing that I'll just say, you know, just, you know, bragging on the design of Matthew's gospel, he intentionally makes it in this specific way for who he's you know, his audience, I think. And sometimes we just overlook that, I think, so many times in our modern readings, and you know, it's easy to miss his layout, which would benefit us if we did understand how to see it. It helps us focus on his central message of this one, his central message of that one, just for an example. But yeah, there's incredible care and precision that goes on in the way he formats and lays out his gospel. I just kind of wanted to talk about that, but okay, go ahead. What do you got?
I don't think anything else after listening to that.
Oh, come on, man.
I think you just show it off.
No.
I think that's righteousness before men. That's right.
No, that's
Because I was trying to get my head around it, the chiasm.
Well, I think the point he's making is the Lord's Prayer is the central point of all of the
It is.
attitude.
It is.
Right? That's the main.
It's very interesting.
But it's interesting, you talk about your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's kind of center point of the prayer itself.
It's very
Follows
interesting.
I think that it can be hard for us to, at least for me, it was hard for me to imagine this idea of practicing your righteousness before men, so others may see it in our context here, because we do a really good job of hiding it. But overseas, it is just exactly like he says. People will carry counters in their hands and keep up with how many prayers they pray a day, how many times they repeat the certain things. And so it's this little ring they wear on their finger, and they'll go around. You'll be a taxi driver, and they'll just be counting the number of times he repeats something. And so everything that Jesus says here is actually real life happening, at least in Nehemiah, and in context around the world. People their entire religion is based around showing that to other people, showing that righteousness to other people. So when brand new believers read these passages, it's absolutely mind-blowing for them to understand that God, and it repeats it many times, God is a God who sees in secret. Your Father rewards you, and He sees in secret. And so it's a different way of relating to God the Father that they related to idols and these other things their entire life. And so I know for us at times it can be like, oh, Jesus said this, but like it's like right there in front of your eyes overseas how people do this.
Is that Buddhism?
That's Buddhism, no. Well, I mean, if you look at all religions, almost all religions, they are works-based, righteousness-based religions. And that is done in front of others, and it's done so other people can see it. And the fasting's the same way. The monks fast for 12 hours a day, every single day. And when other people fast, they don't fix their hair, they look all disheveled and all like, oh, I'm fasting today, that kind of thing, It's interesting.
One interpretation of, the in your room. You go to your room. So Augustine, he uses one of the Psalms talking about your inner room is your inner heart, and like that he equates that to it's all inside. It's not this physical place. It's not this place that you have set up in your home for it, even a closet or whatever the translation is. But like it is your inner heart, to some degree, which I really like. That's the opposite of like we're saying, showy and everybody's seeking. I really like that.
And I guess it goes back to the salvation. We're not responsible for salvation. Even though we like to think we are. Probably all at one point in time think about what do we do? What do we do? It's just not about that. That's amazing. 2,000 years ago, we talked about these things. Again, I haven't heard that one.
I think a good discussion question may be what are some modern masks that Christians wear? That's a good discussion. I feel like there are some.
When I was growing up, you put your name plaque on the pew that you donated,
That's good. Or even in the Bible itself, maybe.
That was a long time ago.
Well,
This window was donated, this stained glass window was donated by this family.
of course, we still have our own pews that we sit in.
It's true.
Bill T, he told the story of he went to a church in Dalton, and like everybody else, they sat in their pews, and this woman came out, somebody was sitting in their place, and he said she was as far as made him get up and move out. Made visitors get up and move out of her pew, until they were sitting in her place. So,
I think a good one for me is kind of like when you have someone who's in your life, maybe your neighbor or your coworker or something, and you've known them for a long time, let's even say years, and then you find that they go to church. You're surprised by that. I think that's kind of what like it's only maybe you're only spiritual on Sunday, and the rest of the week you just kind of put it on the back burner. That's not who you are the rest of the time.
So with new believers that come to faith, we use the Lord's Prayer as a pattern, not necessarily something they're supposed to say in rote memory, but it's more of a pattern that they would use in their remind them, like, okay, in your everyday prayer, always praise God. Always ask for His will to be done and not yours, so it sets your heart right, not on your own things that you want, but on God's things. Then you ask for your own needs, because we have our own needs. And then you ask to forgive, ask God to help you forgive others, and then to turn away from evil, because we have temptations every day to sin. Ask God to help you turn away from evil. So anyway, this is kind of a pattern we use to teach people to pray overseas, not necessarily the Lord's Prayer word by word, but just something for them to do everyday life.
I think it's great.
That's very cool. I don't know if it's right or not, but we're just trying to teach people that are just, okay, every day, what do you do? What's the hand motion? Show them what they are. Okay, well, you're going to praise God, you're going to forgive others, you're going to do these things. But, yeah.
That's good. I like that. Another good conversation is, the heaping up the empty words of the pagans. That's, sometimes I do think we get in a repetitious mindset where we're just kind of going through the motions so that we can eat, or so that we can this, or so that we can whatever these things, without putting the love in it and the personalization that it's supposed to have. I think we're probably all guilty of that at times. That's an interesting part to it as well.
Have you ever noticed, I'm gonna brag on you, Dennis, for a second, that we talk about the long wording, but have you ever noticed Dennis's prayers were just the right?
That's good.
They're not short, they're not long, they're just right. I appreciate that, Dennis. Dennis is always right. Even the written prayers, just right. And but I've wondered, and I'll ask Dennis this, because how do you get to where you can do that? I can't. I don't have that. I can't do that. And it's probably practice. But that's probably what it is. You could probably be teaching this when I was looking at it. I think Dennis could be teaching this, not me.
Listening to someone pray often is a measure of how well their personal prayer life is.
Oh, absolutely.
And when you listen to someone like Dennis pray, you know that he prays personally. And just like you were saying, it's so easy to get repetition when we're praying over a meal or something like that. And it's really just a time to stop and thank the Father for providing for us today. But I get this too, even with in front of my kids, and I'm like, don't do this, but it's the same thing you're saying over and over. But it's really just a thankful heart for what the Lord's done so far in this day. Yeah.
I'm amazed that when I'm speaking in public in general, but praying in public, when I get up there, everything seems to come fast to me. I want to say it fast. But have you ever noticed Dennis in the beginning, he'll slow down. I don't know how you have the discipline to do it. He'll slow down, he'll pause, just the right time, get to slow down, and then he'll begin to pray. This doesn't come natural to me.
I feel like Dennis's prayer closet is very organized. Well, mine's just this.
Well, yeah.
Disorganized.
But, Dennis, you're teaching us. We've been paying attention to how you do it, so we appreciate it. Come and gone, yes. I was thinking it'd be a struggle to get through. Sure, yeah, we're talking about prayer, pressure on you. Gracious Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for the opportunity we have to be here in this place, among our Christian brothers. Lord, just step back a few minutes and try to understand exactly what you're saying to us, Lord God. It's amazing, dear Lord, how your words from 2,000 years ago are so appropriate to the culture and the time we live
to get on to you before you got me, you know, so.